Today, we're putting on our detective hats to investigate some of America's most famous stories. We're going to peel back the layers of these incredible tales and find the truth that's hiding just under the surface.
I mean, have you ever heard a story that's so good you just want it to be true? America is absolutely full of them, right? These larger-than-life heroes whose deeds supposedly shape the very landscape of the country. So the big question is, how much of what we've heard is actual history and how much is just, fantastic fiction? Well, let's find out.
Okay, first things first, let's get on the same page about what a legend actually is, because it's not just some random fairy tale. You got to think of it as a story that's anchored in reality. It's almost always tied to a real place or a real moment in history, and that's exactly what makes them feel so believable, so possible.
And this breakdown here, this is really key. See, myths, they're all about gods and creation. Folktales, they usually have talking animals and a nice, neat moral at the end. But legends? Oh, they're in this fascinating middle ground. They just feel different, Because they feel like they could have actually happened. And that's the mystery we're diving into today.
All right, let's open up our first case file. We're going to start with a legend that, well, despite its powerful grip on the American imagination, it turns out to be pretty much 100% fiction. We're talking about a guy who was, quite literally, a giant of American folklore.
Yeah, you've probably heard the stories about Paul Bunyan, right? The colossal lumberjack with his giant blue ox babe. They say he could clear entire forests with just one swing of his axe, and get this, his griddle was so huge it had to be greased by men skating around on slabs of bacon. I mean, wow.
So, this tale of superhuman strength, it paints this perfect picture of a guy who could tame the wilderness all by himself. A perfect hero for a young, expanding nation for sure. But behind the giant man and his big blue ox, was there any truth to it at all?
And here's the big reveal. Paul Bunyan never existed. Nope, not a real person. And he wasn't some ancient folktale passed down through the generations either. The whole story was actually cooked up in the early 1900s as a super clever marketing campaign for a logging company. Seriously, it was all about romanticizing the industry and, well, selling more equipment.
So even though he wasn't real, the idea of Paul Bunyan is incredibly powerful. You have to think about the time. This was an era of industrialization, a time when people were a little anxious about machines taking over. So he became the perfect symbol, a symbol of brute strength, of conquering nature, and of that unstoppable American idea of progress.
Okay, let's move on to our next case file. And this is where that line between story and history starts to get really wonderfully blurry. This is a story that was forged in sweat and steel, right in the middle of a huge turning point for America. And this is the legend of John Henry. You've probably heard of him, the steel-driving man, the powerful laborer who went head-to-head with a machine just to prove the worth of a human being. It's an incredible story of determination, strength, and, ultimately, sacrifice. Now, unlike Paul Bunyan, who was totally made up, the legend of John Henry, it has a really solid foundation in a very real and pretty turbulent period of American history. So to really get him, you have to understand the world he was living in. So this timeline here, it gives us that crucial context. We're in the 1870s, right? The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Machines are starting to replace people, and that created some serious anxiety. And the construction of the Big Bend Tunnel? It was a massive, incredibly dangerous job. So John Henry's story, it's not just about a strong guy. It's about all of humanity staring down the future and basically saying, you will not make us obsolete. So, look, that dramatic, heart-stopping race against the steam drill, that part might be a bit of an exaggeration, to make the story better. But, and this is a big but, historians are pretty much in agreement that John Henry himself was very likely a real person, a real man who represents the very real struggle and the absolutely massive contributions of the African-American laborers who literally built this nation's infrastructure.
All right, for our last case file, we're going to look at two figures where the real person actually had a hand in creating their own legend. This is where the lines get blurred between who they really were and who they wanted everyone to think they were.
Okay, first up, Calamity Jane. Her story is a perfect example of how a real person can become a legend by telling a really great story about themselves. Her real name was Marta Jane Canary, and don't get me wrong, she was a real figure out in the West, but she was also a brilliant self-promoter. A lot of her most famous adventures, especially that supposed romance with Wild Bill Hickok, probably exaggerated quite a bit in her own autobiography just to create a more exciting persona.
And in a really similar way, the popular story of Pocahontas we all know, it's a huge simplification of a much more complex and, frankly, much more interesting history. That famous scene where she saves Captain John Smith, yeah, he only wrote about that years later. The reality is, her real name was Matawaka. Pocahontas was just a nickname, and she was only about 10 or 12 years old. What Smith called a rescue was probably a complex tribal ceremony, maybe to adopt him into the tribe. It wasn't a romance. Her true story isn't a fairy tale. It's the incredible and difficult story of a young diplomat caught between two clashing worlds.
So what this really shows us is that when we tell history, sometimes a great story, when it's simple, dramatic, maybe a little romantic, can become way more powerful and way more famous than the actual messy facts of what really happened.
So after all this investigating, what's the big takeaway here? We've seen these stories run the gamut, from pure fiction all the way to exaggerated truth. So, why do we keep telling them?
When you really get down to it, each of these legends, whether they're true or not, they hold up a mirror to the society that created them. Paul Bunyan? He shows us a culture that admired industrial might. John Henry? He embodies the dignity of human labor in the face of the machine. These stories, they show us what the nation admired, what it feared, and what ideals it was reaching for at different points in time.
They're kind of like the threads that weave together a national identity. They tell us not just what might have happened, but maybe more importantly, what we believe about ourselves as a people, our strength, our resilience, that spirit of independence. In a way, they're like our cultural DNA.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. What about the heroes and stories we're telling right now? In our movies, our books, all over the internet? Who are our modern-day Paul Bunyans or our John Henrys? And maybe the biggest question of all, what are those stories going to say about us a few hundred years from now?